To say what little I know, which is that he is active in both the Green Party and the local Occupy movement, is well versed in theory, and I'm sure has a good presentation for us tonight. So thank you, Darin, for coming. Thank you.
First, I want to thank you all for inviting me, and the food was absolutely delicious. My presentation is entitled Occupy Wall Street, Past, Present, and Future. And it's basically broken up into 5 sections. Past, what, how, why, and future. And I'm going to begin with the past by looking at both the long-term background and the short-term background of the Occupy movement. Based on what the Occupy movement has done and how it's organized, it has borrowed from past movements. For example, in terms of the strategy of using encampments, it has borrowed that from the bonus army. Now, for those who may not know, in 1932, veterans of World War I went to Washington, D.C. and camped out on federal land in protest of receiving their bonuses. They were granted bonuses, the ability to have bonuses in 1922, but they couldn't cash in those certificates until 1945. And obviously, when the Great Depression hit, they needed the money, so they demanded to have their bonuses earlier. That movement was eventually driven off by the military, led by Douglas MacArthur. They were driven off the land, and their belongings were burned. That use of encampments to long-term, it occurred in the spring and summer of 1932. It was a long encampment. I believe that the Occupy movement has borrowed that heavily. Another thing in the past is the civil rights movement, especially its use of nonviolent civil disobedience. I think that kind of speaks for itself. Many people are familiar with those tactics, and these are tactics that are being used by the Occupy movement at this moment. There is another aspect that is borrowed from the range of global protests that occurred in May of 1968. The best example of that being the protests that occurred in Paris in May of 1968. These were protests that demanded structural change, and they existed externally to traditional party politics. The great example in Paris is that the Communist Party in France actually sided with the government against the protesters. This was a situation where you had the only organization that actually sided with the protesters were the Situationists, who were a art movement who basically believed in disrupting the commodification of culture. And they were probably the only organization that really sided with mostly students, but these were students that wanted to ally themselves with workers to basically, bring about a deep structural change. We see this now actually in Occupy, where the activities of the Occupy movement is beyond party politics and beyond more established long-term movement coalitions. And then, of course, there is the anti-globalization movement, which actually existed in the 90s and really reached its crescendo in the 1999 protests against the WTO in Seattle in late 1999. And the anti-globalization movement, borrowing heavily from anarchism, was actually able to organize themselves through affinity groups, horizontal decision-making, where there isn't actually an established leader giving orders, and the development of, at the time, what was called independent media centers, which at the time, because of the technology, was basically areas where computers were hooked up to the internet in order to convey news directly at the scene of these protests. And these types of protests existed throughout the globe, wherever the WTO or the World Bank were meeting. And I believe the last big protest was in Genoa in the late spring of 2001. The organizing of these protests through a horizontal decision-making process was what Occupy, I believe, has borrowed directly from the anti-globalization movement. Now we can go on to the short-term background. The short-term background is what's been happening in the past couple of years. We see first and foremost the election of 2008, where there was a voter response to the idea of change, especially the hope for change. And over the years, we have found that maybe that hope for change has been a bit lacking. Now, of course, that can be a whole different presentation on its own, but I believe the factor of disappointment in the rate of change contributed to the growth of the Occupy movement at this time. Then, of course, we have last year, in the early part of 2011, the Arab Spring, where you have the massive change going on, beginning in Tunisia, then in Algeria, and then in Egypt, culminating in February of 2011 with the stepping down of Hosni Mubarak, the dictator of Egypt for over 30 years. This was a major event. It obviously, the best in Egypt, they occupied Tahrir Square and refused to leave until Mubarak stepped down. And there's also the influence of using the internet to communicate and organize and plan for these mass demonstrations. The next short-term influence is actually a person, and that man is David Graeber. He is a professor of anthropology. He is also an anarchist. He has taught at Yale, but now he teaches at Goldsmiths College in London. And in 2011, he published a book called Debt, The First 5,000 Years. And I'm going to do a very, very short synopsis of what the book is about. He basically, he starts off by deflating the myth that currency was a natural evolution of barter, when in fact it wasn't actually just a natural step from barter. It is actually a way of measuring debt. And what he argued is that that debt is in fact a social relationship, first and foremost, and that of reciprocity, where reciprocity means I do something for you, you just do something for me. And these relationships of reciprocity can go in two directions. You can either go into a general mutuality, where you have more of a common resources and a sharing of resources, and you see this in tribal societies. Or it goes in the direction of infinite debt, where the debt can never be paid, and you end up being indebted to leaders. This is he gives a great example about how the question of why would a king demand his subjects pay taxes in gold coin when he owns the land where the gold mines are. The reason is that he uses the tax system to create an infinite debt that can never be repaid, and therefore is able to control his subjects. He then, of course, brings this into the modern time where debt can be used as a form of social control, where we're actually going in the direction of infinite debt rather than mutuality. So he wrote the book on debt. He had been active many years before in obviously anarchism, especially the Direct Action Network. The Direct Action Network uses the horizontal direct democracy type of process that has been adopted by Occupy, but they've been doing it obviously in the context of the anti-globalization movement. Now, the final short-term influence involves actually specific dates. This is the magazine Adbusters. They're a magazine from Canada. They are actually very interesting. They have an online presence, so if you ever want to look them up, they're quite interesting. They have no ads in their magazine. It's about social justice issues. It's about the influence of this late form of capitalism, how it's affecting culture and society and politics. The editors of Adbusters wanted to kind of bring the spirit of the Arab Spring to America. So what they did was in June 2011, they sent a message out to their subscribers to try to see if they can't recreate Tahrir Square. And the initial planning actually resulted in a August 2nd rally by New Yorkers against budget cuts in New York City. When people who were subscribers to Adbusters came, they were actually very disappointed in the rally because it was a traditional rally where people were an audience, and then there was a stage, and people spoke on the stage, and there was no sense of planning or direct democracy, so to speak. So they basically left the rally, and in another part of the park, they sat down and basically, and this included David Graeber himself, and over time they basically planned the initial occupation of Zuccotti Park on September 17th. Now, we're going to go directly into what exactly happened down in New York City. September 17th, Zuccotti Park, thereafter known as Liberty Plaza, was occupied, and basically it was to in the same spirit of the Arab Spring, but at the moment there was no sense of what they were against or what they were for, because they used the direct democratic process to figure that out once they actually began the encampment at Liberty Plaza. Now, if you remember from the news, the first couple of days, in fact the first week of that occupation, the media didn't really pay much attention. It only garnered attention when there were video footage of female protesters surrounded by an orange netting and being pepper sprayed. And I think that grabbed people's attention. Then they realized, wait, oh, this wasn't a one-day protest. They're still there. And they continued to be there. And on September 29th, they issued the declaration of the occupation. The declaration was basically a listing of the grievances and what they found wrong with the society, the politics, the economy. The last line is very significant, and I have it as a full quote. Quote, "Exercise your right to peacefully assemble, occupy public space, create a process to address the problems we face, and generate solutions accessible to everyone." I think this is significant because I think this is the basic blueprint of the Occupy movement summarized in one sentence. They continued to be there. People started to pay attention. There was a phenomenon beside that called We Are the 99%. It was a Tumblr. For those of you who may not know what a Tumblr is, it's like a blog, except people use it instead of posting text to post pictures. But it's the same type of format. You scroll down and it's in reverse chronological order. And basically the pictures that were posted were pictures of people holding up signs describing their economic hardships and situations and saying at the end, "We are the 99%. It was basically an act of solidarity with the movement. And it basically, I believe, helped become, in a way, the new media for this movement, as opposed to the corporate media, which was bound eventually to move on to something else, which, as history shown, what they actually did. In October, you began seeing the global encampments. It was not just New York City; it was everywhere. There were basically at one point, the high point, there were 250 encampments in the United States and over 500 worldwide. Now, November 15th was when Liberty Plaza was officially cleared by the police. The argument made by Mayor Bloomberg's office was that for sanitary conditions. He had said that earlier, and basically in response, the movement went and cleaned the park themselves. Because what was happening that people, I believe, did not know at firsthand was that new models of social organization were occurring in the encampment. People didn't just have tents or sleeping bags, but they also had a library. People would bring in books, and you'd have a small library. Well, it actually grew quite significantly. It started out small, grew significantly. You also had power systems for heating. You also had small little troughs made of pipes for gardens. You had a food delivery system. Basically, they were recreating a society within a larger society. And this was, I think, an important aspect that was very difficult to communicate beyond the site, unless you actually saw it for yourself. Because people thought, oh, well, people are just dirty hippies. Somebody actually in the local Occupy movement back in the spring made a very good point. He said, well, they're as dirty to the same extent as anybody would if they camped in the woods for a long, extended period of time. It wasn't that they were inherently dirty, it was that certain circumstance, it was like camping. And so therefore, certain amenities were limited, but some of them were developed. Now, the encampment, not only in New York City, but worldwide, were basically governed by a General Assembly. Now, I'm going to go and talk about the General Assembly later on, but I just want to talk about one other thing, which was an act of kind of improvisation, where they had, in New York City, they were not allowed to have a sound system. So they developed what is called the People's Mic, where basically somebody would, if somebody was speaking, then those nearby would repeat what he said, and then those beyond would repeat, and then those beyond would repeat, so that the message would be communicated without the need of having a bullhorn or a PA system. And this, of course, ended up becoming a tradition throughout the movement, where you ended up having members of Occupy go to various meetings of officials and do what was called a mic check. Somebody to begin the process yells out mic check, everybody around says mic check, and then they begin the process. They did it for Scott Walker, they did it for Michelle Bachmann, they did it for Karl Rove, they even did it to the president in New Hampshire. So this began to spread the message beyond the particular spatial orientation of the movement, and we ended up seeing where for a brief period the mainstream media was looking at it and actually taking it seriously for at least a short period of time. And as I said, on November 15th, they cleared the park. That does not mean that the park is now completely empty. People have gone back periodically. They've especially gone back for the 6-month anniversary and for the 1-year anniversary, obviously, which gained a little bit of media attention. Now, to show the scope of how this movement spread just beyond New York City, I'm going to use for one example, I'm going to use a couple of examples. The local movement, well, first I want to talk about probably the one that got probably the second most media attention. That was Occupy Oakland. Occupy Oakland started on October 10th. The eventual clearing of the park actually was October 25th. But in that time, there was a very strong movement. I don't know the exact numbers, but some of the numbers were as high as New York City. When the clearing occurred on October 25th, there was obviously much more aggression by the police against the protesters. Some of this actually caused an advisor to the mayor of Oakland, the Democrat mayor of Oakland, to resign. The mayor of Oakland, I believe her name is Janice Kwan, got into a lot of hot water. She had to basically almost apologize constantly for what the police were doing. For example, when the park was cleared, a young man named Scott Olson was hit by a tear gas canister in the head, fractured his skull. As he was lying there, other people came to help him. The police then fired another tear gas canister into the crowd to disperse them. Luckily, he's fine now, but there is footage of him being led away, and he doesn't look good in the footage because people are yelling for a medic, and he's being carried away, and it's not pretty, but it shows how the extremes that the police were going to in terms of clearing the park or preventing marches or basically using any excuse to be repressive against the protesters. And it should be noted that Scott Olson was actually is an Iraq War veteran, a Marine. So this is somebody that showed that the movement was more than just the stereotype that some people make of the left. Now, on November 2nd, there was a general strike in Oakland, organized by Occupy, and it ended up closing the port. It was a gigantic march. I'm sure maybe some of you saw it on the news. It was gigantic. It was probably one of the most significant moments in the overall movement. And it basically showed that numbers were important and that basically numbers were possible with this movement. Another significant thing they tried to do was move-in day of January 28th, where they tried to basically occupy an abandoned building to turn it into a community center. The police came in and basically kicked them out using extreme violence. It's significant to note there were 409 arrests, and all charges but 12 were dropped. And you actually see this later on. You see many of these protesters are being arrested, and eventually there's no case for them, and the charges are eventually dropped. There's recent Chicago, Occupy Chicago protesters were actually just recently cleared of charges, for example. We then have a kind of not splintering, but a branching off of the movement with the phenomenon of the Occupy Marines. They are a Facebook support group of Marines, retired Marines, because enlisted Marines can't protest against the government. So basically, their support group, it started back on October 15th. Sergeant Shamar Thomas was walking home in New York City, came across the Occupy site, and the cops there with their hands on their guns, and he basically pleaded with the police not to harm the protesters, that they're not dangerous, that that they are not, they're not a threat to the police. And basically from that grew the support group, where these retired Marines are willing to go down to the Occupy site and basically support the protesters and make sure that they're not abused by the police. We also have Occupy Homes, which is a movement that engaged in squatting and encampments at foreclosed homes as a way of making sure that people were not kicked out. They also held protests at the banks holding the mortgages. December 6th was a major day of action, and they have been, I believe, most successful in Brooklyn, Minneapolis, and Atlanta, where they were able to basically make sure that the people that were being kicked out were actually able to keep their homes or stay in their homes. And then, of course, we go to the local movement, which is Occupy Elmira Corning. We had an initial rally on November 12th of 2011, and we then started meeting with each other. And our most frequent meetings were held in the spring, and during that time we had various rallies and marches. The rallies were usually at Centerway Square in Corning, and then we marched down to the end of Market Street, where it just so happened was Tom Reed's office. Then we'd march back. We had a rally against the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Amendment, which included indefinite detention of American citizens. We did that in February. We also shortly thereafter did a rally for Trayvon Martin. If you remember, Trayvon Martin was a young black man in Florida walking home from the store when a neighborhood watch captain by the name of George Zimmerman basically chased him down and shot him. I believe that case is still pending, but at the moment we wanted to bring attention to the fact that kind of the sense of injustice of the act. Our biggest events was on May 1st, where we had 3 different events related to student debt. In the morning, we had a student walkout at Corning Community College. About 30 people attended. We got media coverage. We got Nate Shinagawa to come and speak, and we also had Collier Clark, who is the Green Party candidate for U.S. Senate, come and speak. She actually ended up staying at the other 2 events as well. We then had a rally that afternoon at Centerway Square, and then a smaller gathering at one of the churches for a discussion about faith in the Occupy movement. It was, I believe, our high point locally. It brought out the issue of student debt, which, of course, for the local movement, it is student fueled. There's obviously myself. I'm 36, soon to be 37. but many of the students from the college were heavily involved. We're at a point now where, because of summer, and some of the students had to go away because it's a two-year college, so they end up going to other colleges, or in the summer they went away for vacation. We're kind of getting to a slow start. Unfortunately, we're not able to do anything for the one-year anniversary of Occupy. But in June, we did start putting together a mission statement, which is we believe, a list of solutions to the list of problems we described when we did our own declaration back in, I believe, January. So I'm now going to go into the mechanics of the Occupy movement, the how, so to speak. The encampments engage basically in two things. They engage in nonviolent civil disobedience and the reclamation of public space. Now, the nonviolent civil disobedience, as I said before, has a long history. And it basically is well, I think the best way to describe it is the famous poem by, well, not the poem, the famous statement or speech made by Mario Savio about when the machine becomes so odious that you have to put your body upon the gears and wheels to make it stop. I'm, of course, butchering it horribly. I don't have the exact quote. But that, I believe, is the heart of the nonviolent civil disobedience engaged by Occupy. But also, the important thing is the reclamation of public space, because you have this increasing tendency for public space, formerly supposed to be the space for people to congregate, and most importantly, for people to be equals to each other, is more actually either taken over by corporate power or by government regulation, usually a combination of both. So that when somebody is engaging in a peaceful demonstration of public space, the police automatically come. But why are they coming? That's the big question. They're coming not in the sense that they usually do, where there's a robbery or an assault or some sort of crime to stop or arrest somebody. They are there in that context specifically as agents of the state. And in that sense, this is where the nonviolent civil disobedience comes in. You do not react to their violence in order to better illustrate how they are enforcers of the state. Because if it ends up being this very difficult thing, and it can be tempting. I mean, if a cop is beating the living you-know-what out of you, then you feel like you have to defend yourself. It's almost instinctual. But the problem is, if you fight back, it ends up creating this story afterwards that the police were then provoked and they had a reason to use force. So, despite what some, especially on the right, have said about the movement, it is a nonviolent movement. And the reclamation of public space is very important. It's basically taking it back to almost to the public square type of mentality, where most importantly, grievances are expressed and things can be done. Now, the second part of the Occupy movement is the General Assembly. And the General Assembly is, to me, I think the most interesting, because it's more than just a regular protest movement. It is an internal organization of the movement, and it is basically a model of direct democracy. Basically, it uses consensus as to reach decisions. Now, that can take a long time, but it is very helpful, because you then, because if you're dealing with a large group of people, you then have the argument, well, if you just use majority rule, then how much of the majority is necessary, and does it end up overpowering those who are part of the minority? The consensus-based process, believe it or not, has worked. They have come to decisions. Because of the large group, they use various hand signals, such as, I believe, this for approval, this for not approval, this for blocking. If there's blocking, there has to be more discussion, and of course, this feeds into what I said earlier about the people's mic, in order for people to take turns expressing what they believe needs to be done. Now, this then goes into a much more theoretical aspect, something that I have written about in another context. There is this, I believe in the Occupy movement, which is taken from, I should say that, and also the model of direct democracy is also taken from this, the history of anarchism. is taken from it, I believe, this relationship between resistance and creation. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that in this type of activity, there has to be two steps, the resistance part and the creation part. The resistance part is pretty obvious. It's resisting against the existing order. But the problem is, if there isn't a second step, isn't there a creation of a new order that is structured differently than the old order, then the old order ends up being reproduced and coming back. You end up having a situation where the initial resistance, I think probably the best historical example is, of course, the Soviet Union. The resistance against the Tsar was a good thing, but because the revolutionary movement was organized in a military-like fashion, it ended up reproducing the same oppression when it created the new government. So basically, resistance and creation is important. It is a resistance of hierarchy and the creation of a more horizontal, what I have called immanent type of structure of politics and economics. This is in relation to the relationship between theory and practice. In resistance, you can be motivated by theory, by what you theoretically think is the problem or the analysis of the problem, but then you have to have the practice step. How do you put your theory into practice, and how do you actually create a new society, new political forms, new economic forms? Because that is at the heart of the movement. It's not just seeking reform. It may seek reform in the short term, but it wants structural change in the long term. Now, you actually see this resistance and creation in the actual organization of the movement. You have the resistance of the encampments, but then you have the creation aspect in the General Assembly, where you end up having, well, yes, now we've held off the police and we're occupying this space. Now what do we do? And then this goes on to the relationship between declaration and vision, now, which is also a relationship between problems and solutions. As I said earlier, the local movement has been working towards a mission statement, which is our list of solutions to the problems we described earlier. And most of the major Occupy sites also had their own declarations in the beginning. Well, there was a national gathering held from June 30th to July 4th of this year in Philadelphia, where they went and there was obviously various marches and rallies, but there was also a visioning process where basically different people from different Occupy groups would come down to Philadelphia. They would then be split up into three groups where they would figure out what they brought, what solutions or what they wanted to see, a vision for the future, what they wanted to see, and what they brought from their local group. They would then order them together. The groups of three would then come together to form a group of 9. They'd make a list. The facilitator of that group would then go on and meet with the facilitators of 4 other groups. They'd combine the lists. They'd put the ones that are repeated the most at the top of the list. And they did this process, this kind of step process, so that basically everybody who attended was able to consolidate everything they brought about a vision for a future. And I've been working on, I was not able to go down to Philadelphia, but afterwards I was able to help out in kind of creating categories, and because it ended up being, if it was in a text document, it'd be 15 pages. It's about 700 some odd statements. And they're a bit abstract, but they are going towards that idea of solutions in response to the problems being described earlier. And so what we have is we have national gathering in Philadelphia nationally, and we have the local mission statement. And those are both examples of going from problems to solutions and from theory to practice. Now, I want to then go on into the future. Basically, where does the movement go, and how does it relate to other movements? And I want to use 2 examples. One is the issue of corporate personhood. What we have with the issue of corporate personhood was something, the major thrust of that movement is a group called Move to Amend, co-founded by David Cobb, who was the Green Party candidate for president in 2004. Basically, it is a movement for a constitutional amendment that does actually two things. It says that corporations are not people and that money is not speech. So it addresses the age-old issue of corporate personhood, but it also deals with the issue brought up by Citizens United. Now, what they are doing is they are working locally with people to set up local resolutions. In fact, Corning, in their August 6th City Council meeting, actually passed such a resolution. The idea is to build up a momentum so that an actual constitutional process that involves states ratifying the Constitution can actually gain some ground. And Move to Amend they spoke at a upstate Occupy conference in Syracuse on June 16th and 17th. There's a lot of people in Occupy that have been working with Move to Amend. And in that same spirit, there's also a relationship between Occupy and the issue against hydrofracking. The most significant example I can give is also at the Upstate Occupy Conference in Syracuse on June 16th, when Bram Loeb of Frack Free Nation spoke. He's also a member of Occupy. In fact, I should note that in Syracuse that weekend, there was an occupation of a park. I was part of it. He was a part of it. I slept at somebody's house. He slept in the park with others. He's very committed. He's very committed to using direct action and using nonviolent civil disobedience to oppose hydrofracking. At the conference, he announced that there was going to be a die-in at Andrew Cuomo's office the next week in Albany, but that too is also related. The hydrofracking issue is also related to local resolutions. Many of you who might be familiar with Democracy School, they are an organization they're these seminars that are started by people from the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and they have talked about how you need to move from an initial appeal of permits, which is how it started, what happens if you appeal the permit and you win, the community wins, then the corporation, and this is not just for hydrofracking, but this is also for sludge dumping or factory farms or other type of things like that. If you appeal the permit and you win, they can just go around and just reapply for the permit with fixing the problem that you ended up pointing out. So you end up moving from appealing the permit to a much more larger addressing of the rights of a community. And in this case, in terms of hydrofracking, it's the rights to clean water. Because you're dealing with a situation where the corporations are not only, they use the Commerce Clause to say the local communities can't regulate businesses to that extent in their communities, but then they move on, and then of course they end up running candidates for office, and then they have a direct hand, maybe in some cases, especially true in Pennsylvania, of shaping environmental law. So you find, and there's been in the past couple of months, a lot of direct action in regards to the opposition to hydrofracking. And I believe that this is a synergy that has existed with Occupy. I believe a lot of people that are part of Occupy are also part of these direct actions. Because there's a bit of the history to it. Right? There's a bit of experience. People that have been in Occupy know how to deal with this, maybe a bit more than people that are concerned about their water but have never engaged in these tactics before. So the future is one, and another aspect of the future is what I'm trying to do locally. Now that we're in the second year of the movement, to occupy the city council. And that is to be a constant presence with large numbers at city council meetings. And during the public question period, basically say, we have this idea for a local law based on our mission statement, or what we talk about in our mission statement. that we'd like to see passed. I believe that the time is right for it. I believe that we're entering into a more concrete area of the movement where we're actually implementing the solutions. Because one of the things the media had said for a long time was, oh, they don't know what they're against. No, we knew what we were against at the beginning because we democratically put together a declaration. But then we had to also use the direct democratic process to determine how to solve those problems. So basically, that is my humble attempt to summarize the Occupy movement. It is definitely not dead. It's just that the media is not paying attention anymore. Thank you. So it looks like we have a lot of time for questions. So anybody have any questions?
Darin, I must say, I had questions that I wanted to ask you, but you really covered most everything. I'm
Okay.
so glad you covered, the corporation, the Supreme Court decision and all that.
Right. No, I mean, there's definitely, the idea that move to amend is not really that separate from the Occupy movement. There's a lot of going back and forth. I think what's different with move to amend as opposed to, like I said back in August 2nd of 2011 with the New Yorkers Against Budget Cuts, it's not a top-down type of organization. Because I think that was the initial worry of the first planners, is that they wanted to do something more like what the anti-globalization protesters were doing. They didn't want to do, no offense to the people who were involved, I was involved, the peace movement this past 10 years. Because the peace movement were made up of a coalition of various organizations, and then they would plan these big marches, and they get permits. Sometimes getting permits is not necessarily a good thing. In this case, you get permits, and you end up having, like, for instance, February 15th of 2003, biggest worldwide protest against the war in history. The war started anyways. I think there is this problem. What that Occupy broke through was, well, no, we don't need to ask for permits. We just take the space because it's public space. And I would argue that and some people are saying, well, can the encampments go on forever? I mean, obviously, some still do. Some haven't. For instance, locally, we never did an encampment. I think there's some structural problems that have to be dealt with. Initially, in New York City, there was a lot of initial support. People would take in laundry and do laundry in their homes, then bring it back. This support network, money was actually coming in for donations. I think the second stage is now more, we address what can we do to change our communities, to create this catalyst for change, deep structural change. The type of structural change that the anarchists have been talking about, I would say more than the traditional reformers. Yeah.
Could you, I haven't been paying attention with current events, and could you fill us in on Arab Spring?
Oh, how is it going now?
Yeah, and how it got started and what it's all about?
Well, basically it started in Tunisia. And some people say, well, you have to keep in mind that Tunisia, Algeria, and Egypt have all had basically the same leaders for many decades. Hosni Mubarak was president of Egypt when Anwar Sadat was assassinated in 1979. Algeria, I do remember in the early 90s, they had elections, and the fundamentalist Muslims won a majority, so they canceled the elections. And they hadn't had a free election since until 2011. Tunisia, I don't really know their history that much. I do know that the president of Tunisia was president for about as long as Mubarak. What had happened in a village in Tunisia, a female inspector of one of the markets slapped one of the sellers of the market, and in protest he set himself on fire. That, some people say, well, he just got slapped. I think that they had a context of a larger government oppression, and he just couldn't take it anymore. And people, I think, rallied to that symbolism, and the sheer, he was so desperate, he just killed himself. And so people responded to that. And there was a tipping point, and people said no more. And then once Tunisia actually changed over fairly quickly, then Algeria very, very quickly, and then I think Cairo had people who had been opposed to the government for a long time, but they ended up getting picked up by the police and detained and tortured. And there was, I think, a strong movement to use the internet in a very decentralized way to organize so that they could come together without having to be detected beforehand. I think when they occupied Tahrir Square and refused to leave, and you saw a lot of cooperation, you saw you saw the Coptic Christians protecting the Muslims when it was during their time of prayer. This great camaraderie. The police would come in and bang heads occasionally, but they stayed. And eventually, Mubarak resigned. And basically, the idea was they can do it there, where they actually don't have any, where there was no really shredded democracy. And I think we could do it here. Now, as to how it's going on now, unfortunately, I think that Libya discredited the Arab Spring because we interfered. Or I should say NATO, well, we through NATO interfered. And basically the motivation to overthrow Gaddafi was not the people's motivation. It was our motivation. I think you're seeing the same thing in Syria. What's going on in Syria is a horrible situation. But the thing is, if we got ourselves involved, it would not only be bad for us because it would be another conflict that we'd be interfering in, but also we would discredit the validity of the actual rebel movement in Syria. There is, I was going to bring this up, but I keep on thinking, I want to say Benin. It's on the Arabian Peninsula. It's a small country. It starts with a B. They tried to have an Arab Spring type situation there, and there was crackdown, and basically with assistance of Saudi Arabia. Bahrain. Thank you. Yeah, that was so that unfortunately never went anywhere. But if you were to ask my opinion about how Egypt is doing now, I say they had free elections, and that's the point. And like, if you learn from Algeria, you can't save democracy by canceling the election just because the person you think will take away democracy won. It's a conundrum. It's a big paradox. But you can't cancel the election. You just got to make sure that there's going to be a next election.